Jacob, leaves his hometown to find himself a wife, also to escape the wrath of his brother Esau. And he arrives in Haran, and he meets Rachel, who was destined to become his wife. And when Laban, Rachel's father, and Yaakov's uncle, he was Rivka's brother, hears about the arrival of Yaakov, so what does he do? So the Torah describes it as follows. When Laban heard the news about Yaakov, his sister's son, he ran towards him. When he embraced him and he kissed him, he brought him into his house and he told Laban what had happened. And Laban said to him, I should really turn you away, that's assumed, but you are my bone and my flesh. In other words, you can stay. And Yaakov stayed with him a month. And what was he doing? He was working for Laban. He was taking care of his sheep. After a month, Laban says to Yaakov, should you work for me for free just because you are my relative? You're my brother? Tell me what your wages should be. And then the Torah goes on to say that Laban had two daughters. The older one was called Leah, and the younger one was called Rachel. And Yaakov loved Rachel, so he said, I will work for you 7 years for Rachel, your younger daughter. And that's exactly what happens. At least Yaakov thinks it's going to happen that way. 7 years he works, and he's tricked, and he gets Leah. But a week later, he gets Rachel. That's another subject. So in this little narrative, Yaakov meeting Laban and Laban taking him into his house because, after all, you're my brother, you're my flesh and blood. And then he works for him for a month, and then Laban says to him, just because you're my brother, does that mean that you're going to do this for nothing? You won't get paid? Tell me what your wages are. So there are many questions, 4 questions here. It's not Passover, but we can still ask 4 questions. 2 of the questions are raised by the great Sephardic commentator known as the Or HaChaim. And he says as follows. Laban makes it sound as if Yaakov was willing to do all this work for nothing. And Laban graciously says, do you think I'm going to let you do this for nothing? I have to pay you. Tell me, what do you want? But Yaakov was certainly going to ask for remuneration. There's no evidence that he wasn't going to ask. And the second question is, why did Laban so dislike the prospect of Jacob working for free? Laban was not someone who was so committed to honesty and integrity. He tricked Yaakov countless times later on, beginning with the trick of giving him the wrong woman, the wrong daughter for his wife. And all of a sudden here he's becoming so self-righteous that I couldn't let you do this work for nothing. Why is he becoming so self-righteous? But I'd like to add a third question. If Laban didn't want Jacob to work for free, why did he wait a month? He let him work for him for a month, and then he says, I won't let you do this for nothing. And fourth, why didn't Laban simply ask, how much do you want to get paid for your work? Why did he have to throw in the words, just because you're my brother, am I going to take advantage of you? Work for me for nothing? He could have just said, tell me what you want to get paid. There's a Hasidic work, a Hungarian Hasidic work known as Rav Tov, and this is an adaptation of his analysis. When Yaakov arrives, what does Laban say to him? You are my bone and my flesh. What did he mean by that? He meant to say, look, we are essentially the same. We have the same genetic material, and therefore I feel an obligation to take care of you because you're going to be someone who will support my life's work and my aspirations and my ambition, thinking that Yaakov was more essentially like Laban. After all, it's his mother's brother. There's a genetic connection between them. But after staying for a month, Laban realizes that Yaakov is not his brother. Yes, maybe they're related, maybe they're very closely related genetically, but that's only the genes of their bodies, but their souls were very different. Yaakov was entirely a different person. He was not the type of Laban, in fact, the very opposite of Laban. Laban was a scoundrel. Laban was a dishonest person. Laban was a deceiver. Yaakov personified the trait of emes, of truth. And I'd like to add something, that Laban might have done his homework and he might have investigated what Yaakov had to do to have to flee to Laban. And he probably discovered, was probably from the internet, that Yaakov had deceived his brother Esav. That's my type of a guy. That's the type of guy that I can work with, because he's just as devious as I am. And I could take advantage of him, and we'll take advantage of other people. We'll work together in a criminal way. And that's why he says, you're my flesh and blood, not just physically flesh and blood. You have the same mentality as I do. But then he realized that Yaakov was not a scoundrel. Yaakov was not a dishonest person. On the contrary, that was the antithesis of Yaakov. So then the question is, so how did Yaakov trick his brother? Because he was told by his mother he had no choice. But not just he had no choice, he sacrificed his own values, you could say, for a greater value, and that is the preservation of the future for the Jewish people. Had Esav received the blessings erroneously because Yitzchak, Isaac, didn't really appreciate that it would be wasted on Esav, Yaakov would have turned out to become subservient to Esav forever, perennially, and that would have been the end of the Jewish people. He was sacrificing, whether he understood it or not, but his mother Rivka, who was a great prophet, and our sages tell us the matriarchs were greater prophets than the patriarchs. She knew it. Rivka knew that if Yaakov gets the blessings, there's a future for the Jewish people. If Yaakov does not get the blessings, and Esav gets them, that would bring an end to the whole experiment, you could say, the whole divine experiment of forging a Jewish nation through the patriarchs and their tribes. So he sacrificed his own integrity, his own obsession with emes, with truth, to save the future. But Yaakov really did not like what he was doing. It was the very opposite of his personality. His personality was, as it says, ish tam. Tam is related to the word truth, sincere. He was not at all made of the same substance of Laban. And it took Laban a month to realize that Yaakov is not his brother in spiritual terms. And therefore, he says to him, you're not my brother, really, so I can't have you work for me for nothing. You have to tell me what you want. And what did he understand? He understood that Yaakov is not going to be satisfied with any type of physical payment. He won't be satisfied with any amount of money, with any amount of sheep and cattle. Whatever people used to use for currency, no matter how much he will reward Yaakov, it won't satisfy Yaakov, because Yaakov's currency was not money. Yaakov's currency was spirituality, was mitzvahs. Even though in those days the commandments of the Torah were not yet given, as I mentioned in many of these recordings, Yaakov, as well as Yitzchak and Avraham, the patriarchs and the matriarchs, anticipated, they prophetically knew what the commandments of the Torah were, and they practiced them to the extent that was possible in those times. Obviously, they couldn't have tefillin or mezuzah the way we have, or at least the tefillin they can't have, because the tefillin talks about the exodus from Egypt, which didn't yet happen. So it's obvious that they fulfilled the mitzvahs in other ways. The Zohar says, in fact, in this week's Parsha, this week's Torah portion, that Yaakov practiced and fulfilled the mitzvah of tefillin through his efforts with the sticks in order to get his cattle to produce the right kind of cattle, which is a separate subject unto itself. And likewise, other commandments, they fulfilled as many as they could. So Laban is thinking the only way Yaakov is going to want to be my worker, to work for me. And he knew Yaakov would be a good worker. He knew that he was dedicated and he would bring him prosperity. He says, you're not going to do it chinam. Chinam means for nothing, gratis. What does that mean? Where do we find that word chinam used in the Torah? It's used when the people in the desert complained to Moses that we remember the good old days when we were able to have all the food in Egypt chinam, for nothing, gratis. What does that mean, gratis? They were slaves. They didn't work for nothing. They didn't get their food for doing nothing. They got their food because they were slaves. But what they meant is we didn't have obligations to God. We didn't have any mitzvahs that we had to do. And here you're making this quid pro quo that we have to follow God and fulfill all the commandments. We had it for free with no mitzvah. So when you say free, Laban is saying, I can't let you do this work and you will not be able to do a mitzvah with this work. You want to be able to do a mitzvah. Now, what mitzvah could Yaakov possibly do that he hasn't already done, that Laban could provide him with an opportunity to fulfill? After all, if Yaakov fulfilled all the commandments, he already practiced them. What could Laban give him? There's one mitzvah he didn't yet do, which is a question unto itself. Why didn't he do it before? But the one mitzvah he didn't do was marriage. He didn't get married. He waited until this incident with his brother Esav, and he had to flee from him, and that's when he decided to get married. So Laban, appreciating that Yaakov would only take payment, the ability to do a mitzvah in that way, whatever you get is not free. You put your effort into it. And that's why Yaakov says, yes, let me marry Rachel, because by marrying her, that makes all my work, the 7 years of work, all of those 7 years have meaning and purpose. They are not chinam, they're not gratis, they're not nothing. They are filled with substance. People could work their whole lives, put in 12-hour days, some people 7 days a week if they don't observe the Shabbat, if they're not Jewish. And it's as if they never lived a day in their life. They never worked in a way that their work had substance. Judaism extols the virtue of work, of labor, but only in the context that you're using it to produce something that will make your life more amenable to serving God. You'll have the money to be able to support your children's education. You'll have the money to be able to give to charity. Then your work has meaning and substance. It's not chinam. It's not getting all the goodies of life for nothing. You didn't pay for it. Yeah, I paid for it at the store. I used my credit card. But that's not the payment that God wants. God wants that all the gifts that he gives us should be paid for with mitzvahs, with practicing God's commandments and doing good and contributing to the benefit of society. That's what Yaakov was doing. So those 7 years, what does Yaakov say about those 7 years? They were like a few days. The 7 years he waited to marry Rachel. Isn't that counterintuitive? If you are in love with someone, passionately in love, don't you feel agony every day extra that you have to wait? That a day is like a year? It's like eternity? And here Yaakov says the opposite, that the 7 years are like a few days because of my love for her. And the answer is that Yaakov's love was not romantic love. It was much more than that, infinitely more. It was a spiritual love of two half souls, knowing that they are destined for one another to make the world a different world, to change the world, to set into motion a process, a chain that will lead inexorably to the creation of a Jewish nation who will receive the Torah at Mount Sinai, who will go through all the vicissitudes of existence, of life, of exile, until they will reach the final end, the Messianic age, the final redemption. All this was in Jacob's mind, realizing that every bit of work that he did was contributing to that goal, so that he experienced the marriage the way he saw the marriage, even as he's preparing for it. Those prefatory stages were actually part of the end result. He was living the future. He was living his life with Rachel and the spiritual energies that represented. So every moment was so precious, and when you're having fun, time just flies. So that's why Laban was so eager to find a way to pay Yaakov. He knew he's not going to, in the beginning, he thought, yeah, Yaakov will certainly get paid whatever wages he wants. There was no problem. But now, after a month, he sees, you're not really my brother. Are you really my brother? No, that's only genetically true, but it's not true spiritually. It's not true temperamentally. We're polar opposites. I realize that you can't work for nothing. You must do work in a way that is connected to a mitzvah. Here is a question that can be raised. We established that Yaakov's 7 years of waiting for Rachel were 7 years of bliss, even though he was waiting to marry her. It took 7 years, because every moment was a part of the goal of a spiritual end. Every moment was suffused and infused with such depth and meaning. If that's the case, why are we so clamoring for the final redemption? Shouldn't all of our efforts that we do good, every mitzvah that we do now, is really a sample of the future? So we should be in a state of bliss because we're experiencing the future every time we do a mitzvah. Every time we do a mitzvah, we are elevating the world. We're making the world a messianic world. So why do we have to wait so eagerly and be so anxious about the redemption, and we say we want Mashiach now? Don't we have Mashiach now when we live in messianic ways, when we live our lives in the most ideal ways that we can possibly live, when we study the teachings of the Torah that we know that are a sample of what we're going to be learning when Mashiach comes? So we should enjoy life today, not just because of the physical benefits that we have, absolutely not because of those physical benefits, because of the spiritual benefits that we have. And the fact that we're in exile and we still pray and we still study Torah, we do mitzvahs, makes our actions even more valuable. So why should we clamor and demand, we want Mashiach now, we want the redemption now? So there are two answers to that question. Number one, even if that was true, that what we have now is blissful, and we have a taste of the future even now, that is 100% true. But when there's suffering and misery in the world, when there are people who are ill, people who are suffering in every way, physically, and there are so many millions of Jews who are not aware of what Judaism is about. They don't know anything about the Torah. It's not their fault. They're called Tinoka Shenishbu, children that were taken captive and raised in a non-Jewish environment. You can't hold them responsible for not observing. Well, that's the story with most of the Jewish people. There's so much violence in the world. There's so much hatred in the world. So yes, we could bask in this blissful experience of living Mashiach now, but at the expense of every second that we tarry in exile, of so much suffering and so many losses, physical losses and spiritual losses. Every day that goes by, there are Jews who are lost to the cause, lost to the Jewish people, because they didn't get an education and we didn't reach them in time. We can't afford our own luxury at the expense of all those who are suffering. So that demands that we demand, we want Mashiach now. We can't tolerate, we can't stand the pain and suffering that's going on in the world. That's answer number one. Answer number two, there's a fundamental difference between the story of Jacob and the situation that exists today. Jacob lived at the time when this process was beginning. Jacob was not anticipating completing the process in his lifetime or in the lifetime of his children or grandchildren or great-grandchildren. He knew that it was the beginning of a process, so he could focus on the process. When you're taking a trip, for example, a long trip, a 10-hour car trip, and the kids ask you, are we there already? We all know Anyone who has kids knows that experience. And we get upset at the child after asking 10 times, no, enjoy the trip. Look at the sights. But when you get to the destination and there's a roadblock and there is obstructive forces that prevent us from actually reaching the destination, we're right outside the destination, but we can't seem to be going in. It seems that we're just a fraction of a millimeter away from the goal, and that fraction is taking us longer than the whole process. We can't say, well, the process is such a beautiful thing. Yes, it is a beautiful thing, but we can't focus on the process. We have to focus on reaching the end. Things become much more anxious. Things become much more rushed because we can't afford right at this point where we come to the end. Let us hope and pray that we will make that transition from exile to redemption. But even as we are still in exile, we have to remember that every moment spent in taking whatever we do for a livelihood and using it as a vehicle, as a vessel to get closer to God, that is also something that is so precious that it would be blissful for us at the same time that we're upset that we haven't yet reached our destination. As the Rabbi would say, that we have the power to combine opposites. On one hand, we're excited with what we're doing today, but at the same time, we're very upset that we haven't reached the end. We mix this upsettedness, this sadness with joy. As the Zohar says, that we have sadness in one side of our heart and joy in the other side of the heart. Sadness at our faults, at our limits, and joy at all the virtues that we have and all the great gifts that God has given us. The greatest gift that God could give us is to bring about the final redemption imminently.